Hi, I'm Sam Johnston. I work for the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. I'm our Coastal Wetlands community organiser working on our Coastal Wetlands advocacy project, which launched late last year. I've been working with the NCC for just under 3 years, and the project has launched with a focus on improving the legislative and policy environment for coastal wetland restoration and conservation throughout the state. So the definition that we sort of use is any ecosystem that is permanently or regularly inundated with water. That could be fresh water, salt water, or somewhere in between. Our campaign considers everything from rivers to floodplains, mangroves and salt marsh, and swamp forests, and many more. We define it in a way that's not too restrictive because we want to acknowledge how interconnected all of the systems in a water catchment can be. So if you're looking to protect a salt marsh, for example, I think you have to look beyond the borders of the salt marsh and look at the river and so on. So that's the way that we define it, I suppose, everything within the water catchment. That coastal wetlands are so important and a reason that we're running this campaign. The first one that I think is becoming more and more well known as a value of wetlands and coastal wetlands is their role in both climate mitigation, which is reducing climate change by sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, but also climate adaptation. So that's reducing the impacts that climate change has on people. So that means less erosion in coastal communities, lower impacts from storms, coastal storms, and things such as that. So there's a big interplay there between the climate crisis and the role that coastal wetlands can play. They're also really important habitat for countless threatened species, particularly bats and migratory birds, as well as fish and plants and many other animals. But migratory birds in particular are one that I'm quite passionate about, just because, they're certainly lots of them are on the brink of extinction, and these habitats are just so crucial for them. And there's so many benefits for people as well. They have cultural significance for traditional owners. They have value for local economies in the form of tourism and recreation. They purify water. And for lots of our primary industries as well, they effectively power them. So things such as our oyster industry and fisheries, whether that's recreational or commercial, without healthy coastal wetlands, those industries would really struggle. So they're really important in a lot of different contexts, but I suppose we've seen a lot of different circumstances coming together at the same time that make now the perfect time to look into coastal wetland restoration. The impacts of climate change, incoming investment in terms of the blue carbon investments. There's so many things happening at the same time right now that make it a really unique opportunity to focus on these ecosystems as a campaign. So coastal wetlands sequester more carbon than any other ecosystem naturally, and they do so at a rate significantly quicker as well. So, for example, compared to forests, you're looking at many magnitudes more carbon sequestration from the atmosphere than lots of terrestrial ecosystems such as forests. And yeah, they're effectively the world's predominant carbon sink in terms of the land mass that they occupy. The amount of carbon that they're taking in from the air is disproportionately high. So they're really, really important in that regard. Around Woolgoolga, there's inappropriate residential developments there where the exact same problem is occurring. There's runoff from vegetation clearing, and up there they have acid sulfate soils, so that can actually acidify the water. Compared to other ecosystems, I suppose the boundaries of lots of wetlands themselves are relatively well protected. But compared to other ecosystems, the boundaries themselves are relatively well protected. But it's those things around the wetlands and within the catchment and things that have, for example, runoff into the wetland, that's where lots of the impact from development comes from. So it's not necessarily a wetland being built on top of. Oftentimes it's a wetland being surrounded by development and runoff and the impacts that come from that. So we know for sure that well over half of coastal wetlands in New South Wales have been lost since colonisation began. We've looked a bit deeper into that and had a look at the vegetation models pre-clearing, so pre-colonisation and now. And we've we've specifically focused on low-lying wetlands. So that's at 1 meter elevation is how we've defined that or below. And that's where you've seen some real significant losses. We've published an interactive map that people can look at if they want to have a look at their local area. But some stats we've got from that, for example, in the Tweed catchment, over 89% of coastal wetland vegetation under 1 meter has been lost. 84% in Sydney, 75% in the Richmond, and on the Central Coast, we're looking at about 65% vegetation
Mhm.
loss entirely. Um, and that differs between catchments, but also differs between habitat types. So one that we're particularly concerned about is salt marsh, which in lots of New South Wales is now an endangered ecological community, and that's at risk from sea level rise and so on more than other systems as well. But plenty are degraded as well. So we've seen in many cases what hasn't been cleared, what remains is degraded in some way. We've seen wetlands with pH readings similar to lemon juice. We've seen coastal lakes poisoned with dozens of pesticides. So lots of what's still there is struggling and is degraded. So salt marsh is important for a number of reasons. It's really important for migratory birds specifically. They really like that sort of roosting and feeding habitat where they have a good line of sight of any potential predators. So it's effectively the best habitat that a migratory bird can get, and they are, really increasingly threatened with extinction. The reason that we're worried about them going into the future is because they have probably the lowest adaptive capacity to sea level rise in that they get really easily inundated, and with sea level rising, that puts them at really significant risk, given that they effectively only occur at lower elevations. So it's not necessarily just about what's happened to them so far, which has been devastating in of itself, but going into the future, we need as much as we can to have these ecosystems survive into the future. So the lemon juice one is certainly interesting. So the site in which we saw the site which we visited has previously been tested to have water as acidic as lemon juice. That was the Tuckian Swamp, which is in the Richmond River catchment. So that's what flows past Ballina. As recently as 2 years ago, there's been mass fish kills along that river, a coastal river, which I think a lot of people think is confined to inland rivers, but we get mass fish kills along the coast as well due to issues such as this. That is a consequence of acid sulfate soils. So that's not a problem everywhere, but particularly in the northern rivers and the north coast, that's a result of what were wetlands being drained for mostly agricultural uses. The soil there naturally harbors acid sulfate. So once that reaches the air, once the wetland has been drained, it oxidizes. And when that flows back into the river, that acidifies the waterways and causes a lot of damage. So that's probably the major issue in the Northern Rivers, but there's plenty of issues aside
Mm.
from that. The pesticides example that was in Woolgoolga as well. There's plenty of issues going around, but certainly the most visible one, I think, for most people in that region would be the acid sulfates. Community groups working in the area to try and turn the tide. In the Northern Rivers, for example, we met with Ozfish, who do some amazing work protecting and conserving salt marsh specifically in the Richmond catchment. We met with Positive Change for Marine Life as well, who do something similar on the Brunswick River. So they're doing physical on-grounds works to conserve and restore wetlands. But there's plenty of people that are involved in the advocacy space as well. When we went to the Tuckian Swamp, we met with Tom, who runs a blog called Revive the Northern Rivers. And that's, I suppose, more of an advocacy angle on that sort of thing, trying to raise awareness on these issues. So there's plenty of different angles people are taking to play their part. And I suppose it depends on what their strengths are and what their interests are. But there's certainly
Mhm.
lots of community groups making change in many different ways. So I think certainly when there's a big visible event such as a fish kill that throws it into the spotlight, especially for locals, I do think wetlands do have a bit of a PR problem, especially as we sort of noted earlier. People referring to them as swamps seems to instantly yield a bit of a negative response from lots of people. So I do think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of making sure that people realize not just how important they are for nature, but also how important they are for coastal communities. If you were to
Mhm.
get rid of lots of these coastal wetlands, you're putting coastal communities at significant risk from floods and erosion and storms. Your water is going to be lower quality. You're going to get more of those fish kills. So I think it's about linking the benefits that coastal wetlands provide to people and making sure people recognize the value that they have. In terms of people getting more involved, there's plenty of ways that they can do so. Certainly, education is a big aspect of that, making sure that people do recognize that. Getting on the ground and, getting your hands dirty and restoring wetlands yourself is a way that you can go about that. And we're trying to build a movement throughout the state for people that are thinking exactly the same thing that we are, that this needs to happen at scale throughout the state. Um, and yeah, that's something that I think is really important is building that movement together and making sure people are working together and combining that power so that we can present a united front to represent coastal wetlands. Yeah, so there's a fair few threats. Acid sulfates is certainly one, especially in the northern rivers. Sea level rise that impacts them in a variety of ways, and that will occur differently throughout different coastal wetlands. Sea level rise, the rate is different in different locations, but also different systems cope differently. So mangroves may do a bit better with sea level rise. They can do what's called accretion and build themselves upwards, whereas the capacity for salt marsh to do that naturally is a fair bit lower. Pollution, runoff, aside from acid sulfates, pesticides is a big one. I'll go again to the example in Hearns Lake in Woolgoolga, where there's over a dozen pesticides that have been found in the water there. That was tested by a community member, not the government, and she's found pesticides there that are banned in many countries, and actually a pesticide that's banned in Australia in the water, and that's led to that ICOL, which is an intermittently closing open lake, oceanic lake. That ICOL there at Hearns Lake is now being described as near dead just from that pesticides issue alone. The good thing is these systems can bounce back really well, perhaps better than some other ecosystems. Restoration is a really effective strategy for wetlands. Of course, it's better to keep them there in the first place and keep them healthy. But in our trip to the Northern Rivers, we went to Urunga and visited Urunga Wetlands, which is an incredible site that used to be the site in New South Wales with the most intense toxic heavy metal pollution in the state. So it took the #1 spot for that, and that has now been restored to a healthy, functioning ecosystem. So my belief is if it can be done there, it can certainly be done anywhere else. And I think Hearns Lake would be no exception. Certainly developers out there that do want to build on floodplains. I've encountered it in Western Sydney. There was an example of a developer pushing for loosened restrictions for building on floodplains. That certainly would present a threat for the catchment. Lots of the issues, again, aren't necessarily within the borders of the wetland itself, which have decent protections on site, but it's the developments within the catchment and the developments upstream. And I suppose what doesn't happen at the moment in the planning system is a recognition that these systems are interconnected. And if you don't have a healthy river that's feeding into the wetland, then the wetland itself won't be healthy, even if the wetland within its borders is protected. Certainly inappropriate developments are an issue, I think, for the environment in general, and the planning system needs to be able to solve the housing crisis on the one hand, but certainly not do that at the expense of well, not just the expense of the environment, but also at the expense of people, because as I've said earlier, if you are to remove coastal wetlands, you're putting those communities at greater risk. And of course, if you're building on floodplains, you're putting communities at greater risk as well. So it's not just a matter of the health of the wetlands, but also keeping them intact is crucial for the houses that already exist and any houses that go up that are in appropriate areas that are appropriate developments as well. So a big one for us that we're focusing on at the moment is the legislation that surrounds wetland restoration. So there's an incoming opportunity for lots of funding to be put into these projects, these blue carbon projects, through carbon credits and so on. We've had one now accredited in Queensland. I was there the other week in the Sunshine Coast, the Blue Heart project, which was done by council, and then quite recently also in South Australia, there's been an accredited project there, which is a restored wetland that's going to generate income for the people that are doing it. This is state legislation, so it comes to this. And if you are to put in a request for a restoration project for a wetland at the moment in New South Wales, you actually have to go through the same planning pathway as a developer who wants to build a block of flats or any for-profit development. And that's really prohibitive for, small community groups and NGOs and so on. And there's a reason that it hasn't happened in New South Wales yet. And we're really missing out on opportunity here because the money is going to start flowing in, and we just don't have the legislative framework in New South Wales at the moment for these developments to make any sense. It's really expensive, it's really time consuming. Even if you own the land and you're ready to restore it to wetlands, the loopholes you have to get through and the amount of bureaucracy you have to get through is quite astonishing. There's dozens of pieces of legislation that would apply to it. So that's something we're trying to do, and the government knows that that's a problem, and it needs to be fixed. I can't say for sure. To be honest, it seems like it's just not a priority for them, which I think is a bit of a mistake. As I've noted, there's so many benefits that come from coastal wetlands in the age of a climate crisis. You really want to be protecting people from the impacts of climate change, and that can't be done if it's prohibitively difficult to restore a wetland. But also there's money that's going to be coming in, and it's going to be flowing into other states where the investment is easier to apply to a coastal restoration project. So I think it's a bit of a lack of prioritization, and we really want to see the government prioritize this so that wetland restoration and just nature restoration in general has its own fit for purpose pathway through the planning system so that people doing it don't have to go through the same pathway as a for-profit developer. Yeah, so Ramsar in New South Wales, we've got three coastal Ramsar sites, one in Sydney, one in Newcastle, and one in Mile Lakes.
And
They
that's you.
That's it. That's all we've got on the coast, which is significantly less than inland and significantly less than other states have on the coast. Part of that is absolutely, it's really hard to get Ramsar listing and it requires funding. So I'm aware of a few groups in Port Stephens who are looking for Ramsar listing for a local wetland there, which would meet the requirements, but the money's just not there. The council perhaps understandably can't or won't pay for it. And they've taken that to state government, and it seems like state government doesn't want to pay for it. So the question is not whether it's eligible as a Ramsar site, but who's actually going to fund it. And no one seems to be putting their hand up for that. Opinions on the carbon market. Certainly, we have our opinions on offsetting. Offsetting fossil fuel projects shouldn't go ahead. You shouldn't be able to offset pollution if you're, but this market is going ahead whether we like it or not, I suppose, and that money is going to be available for projects like this. And blue carbon is proven to be an effective way of sequestering carbon. So, this market is coming in, and I think New South Wales should be prepared in that people should be able to take advantage of this and earn money from their land. I mean, an example would be a coastal farmer whose land is now becoming unviable due to sea level rise. A way to continue earning from that land and providing a different type of public good as their land becomes unviable for agriculture could be restoring coastal wetlands onto property, sequestering carbon, and earning some money through the blue carbon market. But that can't happen if they have to go through a million different approvals. A farmer is not going to be able to do that. They're not going to have the capacity. Well, I would say there's multiple parties that have met with the state government about this. They're very much aware of the issue. We haven't seen any movement yet, so we're going to keep pushing on that. They know that the issue is there. They know that this is something that needs to happen, but we just haven't seen any movement yet. So we need to keep pushing on that and make sure that it's treated as a priority rather than something on the too hard list. So the big move for us in the next year is facilitating a broad statewide network of people that are working on coastal wetlands to conserve and protect them. There's a lot of people doing a lot of great work, but in many cases, they don't know what the group next to them is doing. There's not much communication between groups, and we think there's a real space that we can fill to facilitate bringing that movement together and presenting it as a united front. And it's not just people that are restoring wetlands, but all the stakeholders. So traditional owners have a very strong connection to coastal wetlands and country, both land and sea. There's the primary industry, such as oyster growers, who, without clean water, their industry just can't survive. And we've seen declines in the oyster industry in places like the Northern Rivers because of these issues. So they're very much on side. Commercial fisheries, coastal wetlands support the fish habitats, they're fish nurseries. So they very much rely on coastal wetlands. So it's bringing all these people together so we can present a unified message that prompts the government to treat this seriously and treat it as a priority, and get us reform that makes restoration possible as quick as possible.